I'd like to welcome everyone. We are pausing for a few moments to let everybody in to the session. We'll begin in a moment. On behalf of my colleagues at Network, I am delighted to welcome you all today to this very important conversation. My name is Mary Novak, and I serve as Network's Executive Director. Thousands joined us previously for White Supremacy and American Christianity, the conversation we had on April 9th, appropriately right before Holy Week. Today, we have participants from over 40 states for this conversation. As you may have heard, we are a little over a week away from the midterm elections, and thus this round of White Supremacy and American Christianity, how it harms our churches, politics, and communities, could not be more timely, especially after the events of this week. To open us with prayer, it is my pleasure to introduce Sister Addie Lorraine Walker. Sister Addie is a school sister of Notre Dame and the recently elected president of the National Black Sisters Conference. The National Black Sisters Conference, or NBSC for short, is a national organization of more than 150 Black Catholic women religious, founded in 1968 to serve as the unifying voice and forum for religious Black sisters and associates. The NBSC and its members have been at the forefront in the struggle for justice for decades. And at their annual meeting this past summer, Sister Addie was not only elected president, but also received the conference's 2022 Harriet Tubman Award. Sister Addie Lorraine Walker has spent the majority of her ministry in Louisiana and Texas, including 9 years, when she served as provincial leader of the SSND Dallas province. Currently, she serves as professor of practical and pastoral theology at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas, where she is also the founding director of the Sankofa Institute for African American Pastoral Leadership. Sister Addie Lorraine, thank you for praying us into this time together. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you. And we begin with a song.
Come by here, Lord, come by here. Come by here, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. Somebody needs you, Lord, come by here. Somebody needs you, Lord, come by here. Somebody needs you, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. Somebody's praying, Lord, come by here. Somebody's praying, Lord, come by here. Somebody's praying, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. Lord, come by here.
Come by here, oh God. Come by here. Come by the many locations from where we all are connecting to this webinar. Come by here, oh God. God, please come by here. We are praying this hour. In fact, begging that you come by here. Not just somebody, oh God, but all of us really need you to come by our homes, our neighborhoods, our cities, our countries, our world, in every place, in every heart. We need you, oh God. Come by here, oh God, and anoint our presenters, our panelists, our moderator, that they can bring us a word of truth from you, a word that will teach us and change our minds, a word of truth that can free us to love ourselves and one another, a word that, like a balm in Gilead, can heal our sin-sick souls and bind us together as one family in God. Come by here, oh God. Let your spirit power work in and through our presenters. Come by here, oh God. Come by here and touch those of us who have gathered for this webinar. We come seeking a word from you, a word that is truth, a word that, if embraced, can heal and transform us. Come by each location, oh God, and help us to receive the word of truth that will come. Let it change our hearts and minds and our wills so that we might better reflect who you are and whose we are. Human creatures made in your image and likeness, made to love and care for one another and to care for our common home, this earth. This is your vision for our world. Come by here, oh God. Come and change our hearts this time. Change our minds this time. For so many times before, we have resisted change or compromised the change needed. But this time, oh God, we beg you, this time, change our hearts, change our lives. And when we leave this space, stay with us, oh God. And may we stay with you and carry this word of truth, your word, with us as we go, where we go. And may our actions witness to what we have gained here. And without a doubt, then we'll know, and all will know, that we have been revived, restored, transformed, rejuvenated when we shall leave this space. And we pray this in your name, O God, creator of the universe, redeemer of us all, and life-sustaining presence. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sister Addie Lorraine. We are so pleased that that Network's Grassroots Mobilization Outreach and Education Coordinator, Colin Martinez Longmore, could join us today. He and many of our beloved colleagues are finishing up weeks on the road with Network's Pope Francis voting tour. Colin is in Erie, Pennsylvania today with a group of students at Mercyhurst University for a watch party. So please say hello, Colin and friends, if you could turn your camera on. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Thank you, and welcome to you all. And now, to guide us into and through this critical conversation is another beloved colleague of all of ours, Joan F. Neal, Network's Deputy Executive Director and Chief Equity Officer. Joan shares overall leadership of the organization of Network, leads strategic planning, and works to build and strengthen Network's relationships with external partners. As Chief Equity Officer, Joan develops and advances Network's racial equity and justice transformation work, both internally and externally. And Joan is also a co-host of Just Politics, Network's new podcast, launched a few months ago in collaboration with the U.S. Catholic magazine. Prior to serving in this role, Joan contributed to Network as a consultant for strategic planning and racial justice, as a government relations fellow, reforming the U.S. criminal legal system. And before her time at Network, Joan held leadership and executive positions at Cabrini College and Catholic Relief Services. Joan is an associate member of the National Black Sisters Conference and a graduate of the Catholic Theological Union, where she is also a life trustee. Joan, thank you for leading us and guiding us today.
Well, thank you, Mary. It is my pleasure, certainly, and my honor to be involved in this conversation for the first time and now also again with our esteemed guest. Thank you. And good afternoon to all of you who have joined us today. So many of you who have registered and are online with us this afternoon. We know that we are in for a very stimulating conversation because we are so fortunate to have with us again two panelists who are certainly enlightening and engaging on this topic of white supremacy and American Christianity. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. Dr. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that looks at the nexus between religion, culture, and politics, and is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. Dr. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Online, NBC Think, and other outlets. And he is featured prominently in major national media such as CNN, Post, and others. Dr. Jones is also the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. And he writes a weekly newsletter for those dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. You can find that newsletter at robertpjones.substack.com. Dr. Jones holds his PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in Computing Science and Mathematics from Mississippi College. He currently serves on the National Program, Committee for the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Jones served as CEO of PRRI from the organization's inception in 2009 until just this year. Before founding PRRI, Dr. Jones was a consultant and senior research fellow at several Washington, D.C. think tanks, as well as an assistant professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. Welcome, Dr. Robert P. Jones.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Great, wonderful. And joining Dr. Jones again is Father Bryan Massingale. Father Bryan Massingale is the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University, as well as the Senior Ethics Fellow in their Center for Ethics Education. Prior to his appointment at Fordham, he was Professor of Theology at Marquette University Professor Massingale, excuse me, I'm having the same problem you have, Father Massingale, a little bit of congestion. Professor Massingale is a leader in the field of theological ethics. He is a past convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is a member of the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics and serves on the editorial board of Theological Studies, one of the premier Catholic journals of theology. He is a current member and past coordinator of the North American Regional Committee of the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church Project. Dr. Massingale is a recipient of 4 honorary doctorates and has held the Bernard J. Hanley Chair at Santa Clara University. He is also the recipient of Marquette University's highest award for teaching excellence in 2009. In addition to his academic pursuits, Father Massingale strives to be a scholar activist through serving with faith-based groups advancing justice in society. He is a noted authority on issues of social and racial justice, having addressed numerous national Catholic conferences and lectured at colleges and universities across the nation. He served as a consultant to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, to the National Black Catholic Congress, to Catholic Charities, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, and many, many more organizations, including the National Catholic AIDS Network and the anti-racism teams of Call to Action and Pax Christi USA. He is an active participant in a network of Catholic thought leaders striving for fuller inclusion of LGBT persons in society and in the faith community. His contributions to justice advocacy have been recognized on many occasions, and he has received awards from so many organizations, I can't even list them all. Please welcome Father Bryan Massingale.
Thank you, Joan. It's good to be with you and Robbie again. And yes, to your audience, I have a lot of chest congestion. So if I turn off my microphone, it's just to kind of spare them the more horrid noises. But it's good to be a part of this very important conversation.
Well, thank you both. We are so grateful for your willingness to be here with us today. And despite the congestion that I am feeling right now, I am really happy to be with you. So we had a great conversation in part 1 that has seemed to spark additional discussions across the country about this troubling but important topic of the intertwining of the ideology of white supremacy and American democracy with our Christian faith. In April, you both mentioned some of the very real ways that white supremacy has been present throughout our history as a country, and sadly, in American Christianity. And I want to reiterate one very important point that Father Massingale, you made, which is that white supremacy, or when we see it in politics, white nationalism, is not all about hate. It's about deciding fundamentally who does and who does not belong in this country. And of course, we know that's not Christianity. It's not even American democracy. Now, if any of our listeners missed that first conversation, I strongly encourage you to watch it or even rewatch it if you were with us before. You can certainly find it at our website at www.networklobby.org/US Christianity Convo. And I believe there will be a link put in the Zoom chat today, but certainly we will send it out in the follow-up email to this conversation. So we are back for a follow-up conversation because, Robbie, as you said last April, PRRI has found in your research, and I quote, "There is something going on with Christianity in the United States that inclines white people, white Christians, to be more racist," unquote. And as your most recent 13th Annual American Values Survey, just released this past Thursday, indicates, we are now seeing a hardening of the divides in our country on things that really are about Christian identity. As a result, and these are chilling words that I heard from you, you said, "We have gone backward rather than forward in moving toward a more inclusive democracy. Now, not only is this morally concerning, I mean, if people don't see that the mixing of white supremacy and Christian nationalism as being incompatible with our faith, then certainly they can see it's politically toxic. Because what the result of that is that we see, especially white Christians, taking political positions that are not only diametrically opposed to our Catholic and Christian faith, but even advance white supremacy. Now, sadly, this isn't new in the United States, as both of you know, and both of you have chronicled in your books. But we seem to be at a critical point in our history. So let's get into our conversation. A lot has happened in our country since we last talked. The 1-6 committee has held 8 hearings revealing a trove of details about what led up to and surrounded and occurred after the terrible riot at the Capitol and who is responsible for it. The Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision that actually takes away rights from Americans for the first time in our history. Election deniers are on the ballot in 49 states and poised to win local and national office in the upcoming midterm elections. Pastors and priests have preached from the pulpit hatred and misinformation about the Black Lives Matter movement. Hate crimes have increased against communities of color. Anti-Semitic rhetoric has prompted deadly attacks at Jewish synagogues, and avowed white nationalists have been open about their support for these actions, as well as their belief that America should be a Christian country by any means necessary. And that's just the short list of the things that have happened since we talked. So with all of that going on, I'm sure that our listeners would appreciate hearing from each of you where you are at this point in time, and particularly what you are noticing. What are your thoughts regarding white Christian nationalism in light of our changing public national discourse and the threat that poses to our democracy? Robbie, what does your survey tell us? Father Bryan, what are you noticing? Robbie, start us off, please.
Well, thank you. We're going to start in the deep end.
Yeah.
It looks like that's great. Yeah, so I think there's some deeply concerning things, that have happened just in the few months since we last spoke together. I do want to start with this beautiful phrase from Sister Addie Lorraine that I think went by fairly fast, but like change our hearts and like this time. Because I think what struck me is that repetition of this time, right? This is not the first opportunity we've had to respond to these forces. In fact, we can go back decades, we can go back centuries that the Christian church has had a chance to respond. And I think one of the reasons why we are here is because we've had an inadequate response in the past. We have had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to purge white supremacy from our ranks. And we have worked around the edges. We have made episodic efforts. But one thing that's always striking to me is that, there are enough, particularly thinking about people who are of European descent, think of themselves as white and are Christian. And I'll speak as one of those people. There have always been enough of us in American history that if we had stood up shoulder to shoulder at any time and said no to slavery and said no to segregation and had said no to the kind of violence, anti-Semitism, and bigotry that we're seeing today, we could end it overnight. And we have not taken up that responsibility. And I think that's why we're here. And then the other thing before I'll get to the survey thing, but I do want to say, like, you're calling out, this is not Christianity, this is not democracy. And I think it is not the best of those things. But I also want to say, right, that what democracy is and what Christianity is what we live out, right? Those of us who are living in a democracy and living in the church, right? The only expression the church has is the expression that we give it in our generation, right? Each generation has a responsibility of living that truth out into the world. And so to the extent, again, that, white supremacy has been with us in Protestant and in Catholic, circles, it is a failure of us to live it out. And that word too, I wanted to say one quick word about that, because, I think I speak in a lot of majority white circles, and there is a kind of recoil that happens when this word white supremacy gets used. And I find that one of the ways that white Christians in particular tend to distance themselves even from that word is to kind of put it in the past, right? So you hear white supremacy, and what many white Christian people conjure in their minds is some black and white photograph that's like from the 1920s of people in sheets burning crosses, right? And that what that does is it puts it very far away from us, right? It's in the past. It has nothing to do with me. But if we flip that term around and we just say the supremacy of whites, right? This commitment that white lives matter than others, they're more valuable than others, they take precedent over other lives. There is just no denying, that we have lived that out in our democracy. We have lived that out in our churches. And we still see the results, getting to your question, we still see the results of that in our surveys today. We see, for example, a wholesale denial of systemic racism and its, the effects of past injustices on the present. Huge partisan divides on that, particularly among Republicans in the country. Only about a third of Republicans believe that past discrimination has any effect on the present. For example, just to take one of those, and you could go question after question along that. And then I think one of the more disturbing things that we found that's most relevant for this conversation in the political space is we asked a question about whether people believed that America was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians, right? So the basic tenet of white Christian nationalism that privileges people who are of European descent and Christian over others. And we found that nearly a third of the country affirms that tenet. But when we look in political and religious space, we have half of Republicans affirming that statement today, and half of white evangelical Protestants affirming that statement today, and nearly 4 in 10 white Catholics affirming that statement today. So there's clearly, it's making, that idea, right? And I should just say at the outset, that is fundamentally anti-democratic, right? Is made significant inroads.
Yeah, Robbie, I'm glad you began on that note, because I read your latest survey, and I was equally struck by that reality that almost half of white evangelicals and almost 4 out of 10 white Catholics believe that America should be a place that privileges people of European descent, and that God intended America to be a place where that privileges people of European descent. And what's disturbed me, Joan, going back to your question, what have I noticed since then? I've noticed that attitude has become hardened and more dangerous. That what we're seeing now is a willingness among those who hold that ideology to use any means necessary to achieve that end, to achieve a country that privileges white Americans, that says only white Americans are true Americans and all others are Americans only by exception or toleration or not really at all. And to use any means necessary. So as you saw, election deniers, but not only election deniers, but even to the point of questioning the legitimacy of elections. In other words, if my candidate loses, then by definition, it was an illegitimate election. The use of voter restriction and voter suppression and being very open and naked about this. The very fact that you talk about the events of January 6th, I think here words matter. I think we can't call it a riot anymore. We have to call it by its name. It was an insurrection. It was basically saying that we need to stop this election, the results of this election, by any means necessary, including political violence. And just, yesterday, we saw an example of naked political violence. And here I'm talking about the attack on the husband of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. Now, let's connect the dots here, because I think that's very important for your listeners to hear. Just last Friday, there's been a national caravan of white supremacists touring the country called the Rewake America Tour. And last Friday at this Rewake America Tour, Michael Flynn, who was a former advisor to President Trump, basically called himself a Christian nationalist for the first time. And I say Christian nationalist, those are his words. At that same rally, a speaker said that God's angel of death is coming this year for political opponents, including, and I'm listing here, Joe Biden, John Roberts, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, Michelle Obama. And the crowd cheered. God's angel of death is coming. And one needs to understand that even though people don't necessarily call for overt political violence, if you say enough about God, divinely inspired victory and gun rights and God's angel of death, then we can't be surprised when people take violent means to ensure their faith-based, what they see as divinely sanctioned means. Now, related to the attack on the speaker's husband, I just saw in today's Washington Post that the accused, alleged assailant, had a blog which featured titles such as "Were Germans So Stupid?" "Who Financed Hitler's Rise to Power?" "Gas Chamber Doors." This is not the first time we've seen this. The Buffalo killer also had a blog that said that had the same kinds of messages. The assailant in Mother Emanuel Church had the same kind of messages. What this concerns me is that we're seeing now moving out of simply the horrific realm of voter suppression and election denial and suppression, but now the use of overt political violence by any means necessary, and the failure of religious leaders to connect the dots. So just this morning, in addition to coughing or whatever, I went online to the USCCB's website to see what were the Catholic bishops saying about this. Archbishop Gomez, the president of the conference, issued a statement where he said, "I join with Archbishop Cordileone, the Archbishop of San Francisco, where Nancy Pelosi is Archbishop, and in offering my prayers for the full recovery of Paul Pelosi and for comfort for his family. I'm deeply grieved over this violence, which should have no place in our communities, our political process, or our great nation. May Our Lady of Perpetual Help intercede for us, provide healing, and guide us along paths to peace." But nowhere are the dots connected between that act of violence and the larger political currents that we see around us. Nowhere is this called, an act of hatred that's been inspired by the rhetoric of white Christian nationalism. Archbishop Cordileone's statement, which on the Twitter, it says, it's a very bland statement. It says, "Please join me in praying for the swift recovery of Paul Pelosi and comfort for his wife and family too. Mother Mary, hear our prayer." Full stop. I think what we're seeing is not only the increased danger that's going on in our country, but sadly, I think in the Catholic world at least, and Robbie can speak to the wider Christian world, the failure of major leaders to be forthright about the threat that this ideology poses, not only to our democratic process, but how it is fundamentally anti-Christian and idolatrous. But we don't see that kind of forthright taking on. There are groups that have taken this on. Network, the LCWR, in the National Black Sisters Conference, there are groups within the Catholic Church have taken this on and named this, but our leaders so far have failed to exercise the leadership that's necessary to meet the threat that we face at this time.
Thank you, Bryan. Robbie, anything to say about the wider Christian community with respect to the lack of leadership on the part of our leaders?
Yeah, I think Father Bryan's right. I just did an interview with Jennifer Rubin at the Washington Post last week about this, and the just crickets that we're hearing from particularly the white Christian community, right, from which these things are springing. So, it's just so striking to me that, if we ask, for example, the largest Protestant denomination in the country is the Southern Baptist Convention. And it's a predominantly white denomination, has its history actually founded to justify slavery. And if you ask, like in recent years, what has caused them to rally and to make a big public statement? So the biggest thing in recent history is there's six seminaries that train ministers in the Southern Baptist Convention. They got together, the six presidents who were all white men got together, and the main thing they were bothered about was to denounce so-called critical race theory, right? But that's what they got together to denounce. They didn't get together to denounce when Dylan Roof, the murderer and domestic terrorist, we should say a domestic white Christian terrorist, attacked and killed 9 people at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston. What didn't get a lot of press there, and I appreciate, Father Bryan, you bring this up, is in his journals as he was in prison, he spent time, and he was a confirmed Lutheran, right? And he spent time drawing pictures of white Jesus in his prison journals,
Yes.
right? And so what got a lot of attention was his kind of racist rant about starting a race war. That got a lot of press. But if you look at his journals, he was doodling crosses in the thing. He drew a personal logo for himself, and at the center of that logo is a cross. And so he was very steeped in his Christianity, and he saw it as compatible. And in fact, he criticized Christians for being wimpy and called for them to become a warrior's religion and to step into this race war. So that's the kind of point of view. And, to its credit, the ELCA, the Lutheran denomination, did call that out, right? But more recently, it's just really has been crickets and this real sense of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-Black sentiment has just received not that much attention, and people are kind of turning a blind eye to it. But in doing that, it normalizes it, right? It enables it to actually gain one more little toehold as something that is just kind of part of the backdrop instead of something that should be called out.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also need to point out at January 6th, during this, insurrection, which is had strong racial overtones, the use of Christian symbols at that event. That crosses were erected. You saw, people praying rosaries. I think Catholics need to understand that we were not innocent bystanders in this. I mean, we talk a lot about white evangelicals, but white Catholics are deeply involved in this. And again, the silence from our church, that again, when we look at even our document, the latest document, Open Wide Our Hearts, the pastoral letter on the sin of racism, it never calls out white supremacy specifically as a dangerous ideology. It never names white nationalism as a present threat to our democracy. That it uses passive language, passive voice when it talks about that, Blacks were harmed or people were excluded, but who were the agents who did this excluding? And that is not said. And so I think that we need to understand that that we've gotten to the point where, as Robbie says, crickets and silence is a form of enabling. It's a form of complicity. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to call this out, that we're past the point now where we simply can say, oh, isn't it too bad that our leaders aren't in the forefront? By not being in the forefront, they are really responsible in many ways. They are accomplices, and I'm using that word as a moral theologian. They are accomplices in the unraveling of our democracy that's taken place, and in the corrosive politics of racial resentment that has become all too often normalized into contemporary political discourse.
Yeah. And so it certainly seems that whether we're talking about faith leaders or civic leaders, we cannot look solely to our leadership to get us out of this situation. And Robbie, you talked about the only iteration that we see of democracy or of Christianity is the way that we live it out. So, and that is not just limited to our leaders, has to be who we are as people. So it's clear then there's just, a lot of polarization, a lot of dangerous rhetoric in the air and in our environment right now. And this social and political polarization is going to be a problem for a long time. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a quick and easy solution that we can just put into place tomorrow and be on our way towards a unified future. So what do we do about this beyond Election Day? How do we hold our elected officials accountable for delivering the public policies that they promised during their campaigns? How do we hold them accountable for doing the will of the people and for promoting the common good?
One, I want to rephrase your question slightly, because unfortunately, depending on who gets elected, they may well be carrying out the policies that we find really objectionable and really toxic to our democracy. I think you're right that there is no silver bullet or speedy fix to this. I think that, at least from the Catholic perspective, I'm going to throw three things out. The first thing I think we need to do as Catholics is that we need to recover the insight of our former statements on political responsibility that were issued every 4 years. And then in those documents, there was a clear statement that character matters. In other words, that we can't just look at our leaders based upon whether they tick a certain box of certain issues. We have to look at what is their fundamental character like? And I think we've moved away from that conversation because we've normalized all kinds of manner of lying and hypocrisy, as long as the person with the right letter after their name, the R or the D, wins the election. And I think we need to, as Catholics, recover that insight that character matters. Because if you have people of bad character or amoral character in office, then we cannot be surprised when policies that damage the common good follow from that. The second thing I think we need to do going forward is that we need to talk about how do we form people in the virtue of courage. One of the bright spots in this sad situation that we find ourselves is that I was really moved during the January 6th hearings to hear how the courage of ordinary Americans saved our democracy. The courage of poll workers who decided not to be intimidated. Black women poll workers in Georgia who stood up to violent attempts to intimidate them. The low-level staffer in the White House who was alone among her male colleagues to forthrightly say what she witnessed during those horrible events of January 6th. That I was amazed, or even looking at someone like Liz Cheney, and I'll be honest, I don't agree with her politics necessarily. However, she has been forthright and courageous in naming the threat to our country and willing to stand above the good of her party for the good of the country. These are profiles in courage, and courage is a virtue. We as Catholics say it's a gift of the Holy Spirit. And I think that we need to do better, not only teaching people how to be politically discerning, but I think we also need to be better at forming people in the virtue of courage and the willingness to do the right thing despite being afraid. I think that's something we need to emphasize going forward. And the last thing I'll throw out there is we need to recover the insights of not only Pope Francis, but Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, and talking about what does it mean to be truly pro-life.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That we need to understand that pro-life is not simply being against the practice of abortion, but since 1976, the magisterium of the Catholic Church has said that we must not only be against the practice of abortion, but we must also be against those social conditions that facilitate people wanting to engage in that practice. That means we need to be in favor of just wages. We need to ask, how are we protecting families? How are we enable families to exist in dignity and to live in situations where they have access to adequate health care and education? We need to recover the insight of Pope Francis, where he says that, yes, our commitment to prenatal life, preborn life must be passionate, but then he says, equally sacred are the lives of those already born. I think that, yes, character matters, formation and courage matters, but I think also having a far more robust understanding of what the true Catholic teaching about pro-life is. I think these are essential going forward.
Yes, thank you. Robbie.
Yeah, one of the things one thread I want to pick up here is just this bigger picture of how we think about politics, right? Here, and I think what has happened is that in many ways, politics has become kind of the ultimate thing, right? It's governing everything else. And one of the this comment about character matters. We asked a question back in 2011. It was the first time we asked this question about whether basic character matters in our candidates. And we asked, if a candidate commits an immoral act in their private life, can they still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life? And it turns out that most white Christians back in 2011 said no, right? That character actually matters. They cannot just, it's a reflection on who they are, and they will carry that into their public office, right? That was a fairly unsurprising finding. We asked this question again in 2016 with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, and there was a sea change in white Christian attitudes on this question. That it went from most of them saying, no, that's not possible, to most of them saying, yes, that's possible. And basically saying character matters less. And I think part of what we can see in that is this idea, exactly what you said, Bryan, and we see it in this election as well, with deeply, deeply flawed candidates that can't really be defended on any moral plane, right? And yet, because they have the right letter behind their name, people are, doing these kind of moral contortions to try to find ways, as they did, I think, in 2016, 2020, in many ways, trying to find ways to kind of square the circle. But what I think this points to is that there has also been a kind of complete abdication of the idea that principles, the character, any of this matters, right? And part of it is because there is this thinking that there is a kind of divinely ordained end that is so important that we can just throw the principles out, we can throw concerns about character out, and it is really a devolution into a ends justify the means moral theology, right? Which is just really bankrupt at the end of the day, right? Because it's sort of useless as a lever to help us find our way. And you could just justify anything to it. And I think this thing by the other rhetoric we hear, you mentioned the Reawakening Tour, is this very dangerous rhetoric, right? That people we disagree with are not just our political opponents, they are enemies of God.
Yes.
Right. And once you go there, you really can justify the extermination of those people, right? If they are being cast as demonic, possessed, and enemies of God, this ends justifying the means theology can very quickly, as we've seen, turn to violence. And just linking this up in the data, the last thing I'll say is that we do see people, to kind of return to that question I began with, who say that they believe that America was designed to be a promised land for European Christians. There is a positive and strong link between that belief and other conspiracy theories, like the Great Replacement theory that we've seen kind of on Fox News and other places, that immigrants and other outsiders are coming in to replace true Americans. And who are those true Americans? Well, they're white Christian people, right? That idea, the big lie, the election was stolen, is positively correlated with this idea of America as a white Christian country. And most troubling of all, white Americans who say they believe that this was that America was designed by God to be a promised land for European Christians are 4 times as likely as other white Americans who disagree with that statement to say that resorting to political violence may be justified.
Okay, so once again, you've succeeded in bringing us to a really frightening place about where our country is right now. This mixture of racism and political violence and Christian nationalism is a toxic stew. So how do we move out of this? How do we, as people of faith, engage? What do we do to take back the moral ground and hold the country together? Can we hold the country together and preserve a common good when people see things so differently? And if the answer to that is yes, we can, then how do we do it? Where is a place for us to start? Is there any good news in our future? So I know that's a lot, but I know that you two can handle that. So have at it.
Is there any good news? Okay. As a Christian, I have to say yes. Okay. But again, I want to also say that as a Christian, we believe in hope, not optimism. Optimism is a very shallow, facile, that there is something we can do that can just lead us painlessly into a better place. That's not Christianity. Christianity says that, yes, new life is possible, but it's only possible with the death of the old way of life. You have to die to sin in order to be reborn. I don't think we've done a very good job of talking about that. Now, where do we go from here? One, I think that change is possible, but it also means that Robbie said that there have always been white Christians who have been who went along with this ideology of white supremacy. I think we have to also lift up the fact that there have always been a righteous minority who have dissented from that point of view.
Yeah.
I think we need to do a better job of educating Catholics and Christians about what does it mean to be an authentic Christian. So education is one place where we have to talk about, we need to talk about that being a good American and being a good Christian are not necessarily the same thing. So education, I think, is one of the ways out. I think advocacy is one of the ways forward. And here, I would say that we need to understand, and I'm going to talk about the Catholic world particularly, that ordained leadership is not the only form of leadership. So I'm heartened when I look at efforts such as what Network has done with the Equally Sacred Tour. I'm heartened by when I see statements by the National Black Sisters Conference and the Leadership Conference Women Religious. I wish that the Conference of Major Superiors of Men would follow your lead and being more forthright in this. But I do think that there's a way in which we need to look at and realize that ordained leaders, I'm speaking as one, we are not the only leaders in the church. And incidentally, we just had the document from the Synod office this week in the Catholic world that highlighted that very fact, that our leadership in the church is rooted in our common baptism. And so I want to encourage, what the way forward is not waiting for our ordained leaders to point us forward, but for all in the Catholic Church to use their baptismal call to come forward. The other thing I want to point out, and this is something I think that I was looking at Robbie's survey data, and in an earlier meeting, we talked about the fact it seems that white Catholics are more persuadable than white evangelicals. And I think one of the reasons that may be is because, unlike with white evangelicals, Black Catholics are part of the denomination of Catholicism.
Yeah.
Whereas Black evangelicals and white evangelicals are generally in different denominations and different camps, Black Catholics are deeply rooted in the denomination. And Black Catholics have always had a more prophetic voice and witness in the church. I mean, witness Sister Addie's powerful opening prayer. I was sitting there saying, okay, we're having church right now. But that is the genius of the Black Catholic religious imagination and prophetic voice. And I think that what we need to do going forward, how do we heal our country and heal our church, is for the prophetic elements in our church, for Black Catholics, Hispanic Catholics, Indigenous Catholics, to unceasingly raise our voice and call our fellow Catholics to conversion. Conversion is simply a big religious word that means that reality isn't a closed system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where the hope comes in. And I think that we need to realize that leadership is more diffuse in baptism, but also we need to listen to the prophetic voices among us and to see that that's where the future of authentic Christianity is and authentic Catholicism is. And that may be the avenue by which white Catholics might be able to be more persuadable than other forms of white Christianity.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that, we should look for our partners among the larger white Protestant Christians, Robbie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I'm going to just say this white Protestant's going to say amen to all of that. And just, I guess the only thing I'd really want to add here is the thing that I find, so I've spoken to nearly 100 churches in the last couple of years since the book came out, and talking about the one thing I'm encouraged by is that they're actually, the word white supremacy is being uttered in white Christian communities, which is, Bryan can speak to this too, but like, certainly that was not something that I saw very much at all in white Christian spaces, that word coming up, unless you were talking about, again, like the Klan in the 1920s, but to talk about it as a present concern and is something we are still wrestling with. I think that's very deep. One example I'll give, and I think one of the biggest hindrances we have is that we don't know how sick we are. I think this is one of the troubling things. And again, back to this echo, this time, is it going to be different this time? Right. Because it's not like we haven't had, and I think particularly Father Bryan, what you were saying about, it's not like we've had an absence of Black prophetic voices calling us to this work, right? They have been there. I just want to kind of share a couple, and I'm dependent on Father Bryan's work in this space, but here's W.B. Du Bois in 1925. The Catholic Church in America stands for color separation and discrimination to a degree equaled by no other church in America, and that is saying a great deal. This is not a case of blaming the Catholic Church for not doing all it might. It is blaming it for being absolutely and fundamentally wrong today and in the United States on the basic demands of human brotherhood across the color line, right? And here is the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus in 1968.
Yes.
The Catholic Church in the United States is primarily a white racist institution, has addressed itself primarily to white society, and is definitely a part of that society. Absolutely. And I say this from someone who grew up in a denomination that was founded to justify slavery in 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention. So, it's across the Protestant, Catholic, white Christian world. And the metaphor I sometimes give is kind of a personal one. Back in 2011, I had a bout with colon cancer. And I was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. And, for many of people who are here who've had this experience, or a loved one, when you get that kind of diagnosis, you realize, okay, whatever it takes is what I'm going to try to do to get back to health, whatever it takes. Right. And you kind of put down your defensiveness about the discomfort or whatever you're going to have to go through. And, it involves surgery, it involves chemotherapy over months and months of time. And depending on how you respond, in many cases, you feel like the treatment may actually kill you. Right. And in fact, that's partially what chemotherapy is doing. Right. It is like blasting your body because it could be everywhere. Right. Yeah. And I think that we have too often thought, okay, we can fix this problem of white supremacy in our midst by, changing some words in a hymn,
We're going to, change the liturgy up a little bit. We'll stop doing racist forms of communion and receiving the Eucharist in racist stages and making all African Americans sit in the back of the congregation. We'll kind of do these kinds of reforms, and then we're all good. But I think what we haven't really wrestled with is that really for all the kind of, history going back to the 15th century and even further, the Christianity we've inherited, both Protestant and Catholic, right, has been so deeply rooted in this idea that all of it, the theology, the hymnody, the stained glass windows with white Jesus in them, all of these things have been formed. It's almost like a vine that has to grow around a pole that's already there, right? And that pole has been this presupposition that European people are superior to others. And so all of this historical theology grew around that shape, right? And so if we're really going to take this on, we're not going to be able to like prune the outer branches, right? We're going to have to like go back to the root of it and really take it that seriously. And if it means that the kind of reforms we have to do are going to be so much that it might, in fact, look like it's going to kill the church as we know it, I think we got to be prepared to do that, right? But that's a way of kind of moving the church into faithfulness, right? That's not anti-Christian, it's not anti-Catholic, it's not any of those things. It really is an act of faithfulness, but it may indeed involve some really uncomfortable and even destructive things, right? That help open our eyes in some other ways. But I'm hoping that, and I'm seeing some of that actually on the ground in local congregations, in particular, less at the national denominational level, but more at the local level, where people are trying to live into this this reality.
I just have, when Robbie's talking about this, that I think all too often what he's talking about is for the Christian church, Catholic and Protestant, to have the courage to enter deeply into the Paschal mystery, to have the courage to die to a false self, which is what racism and white supremacy really is. It's a false self. But the thing is that, as Robbie says, people don't understand how sick they are. The church doesn't understand how sick it is. They believe this false self is real. And so when you attack the false self, people get really nervous and upset. But we have to have the courage to die to that false self so that we can rise to something that is truly authentic and really Christian. But I think that means that we have to become far more forthright about preaching about the Paschal mystery. And I think for most Christians, the cross is just this embarrassment for most Christians. We don't really want to embrace the cross. But I think that's what is calling us to, if we're going to really get beyond where we are.
Yeah, and I think that that's certainly true in our civic life, in our democratic republic. That we have to tell the truth about the history of our democracy. We have to tell the truth about where we are right now in our relationships with one another and in our citizenship. And that will lead us to perhaps some very even scarier places than we are right now. But I do think that that is the step by step, that is the way that we have to go. That is the road that we have to travel in order to save this democracy. And I think it's going to be challenging. It's going to be hard. But it is at least I'm convinced, and I am a person of hope. I am convinced that if we do that, if enough of us do that, that there is good news for us in the future. So thank you to the both of you for, again, another stimulating conversation. We could go on forever. I have, a few more questions I'd like to ask, but I think it's time for us to say hello to our Erie, Pennsylvania, Mercyhurst audience. Hi, everybody at Mercyhurst. And Colin, our colleague. There you are. All right, Colin. So do we have any questions or comments from the students there at Mercyhurst for our two speakers?
My name is Mary Nelson. I'm a secular Franciscan here in Erie, and I'm the team leader for our local. I'm the team leader for our local network advocacy group.
Hi, Mary.
My question, or I would just like to ask you to comment on the recent news that Elon Musk has purchased Twitter, and the explosion of dangerous rhetoric and racist and anti-Semitic remarks. Network has been teaching us in their Pope Francis voter tour to develop deep, authentic relationships in order to get to those persuadables. But so much of our life is lived online with people elsewhere in the country and elsewhere from our immediate circle of friends. Can you just comment on the Twitter purchase and the fear that it's going to explode this white supremacy and racist and the dangers that it can pose to us?
Thank you, Mary. And I would say let's broaden that question to just talk about the role of social media in advancing the toxic environment that we are in right now, the dangerous rhetoric that continues to ratchet up the stakes. So, Robbie, maybe you want to start?
Sure. Well, we're clearly seeing are at a time of flux with social media. You know, I'm old enough and older than some of your members there in that room to remember when the great promise was that social media was going to save democracy, right? It was going to kind of level the playing field and give people kind of equal voice, and wouldn't have to depend on groups that had more powerful voices than individuals and all of that. I mean, that was the thing. I think there's not too many people who would naively say that anymore. We've certainly seen that it can be used, like many human tools, for good or ill. And there's something about the way that many of those platforms function, right, that kind of brings out the more extreme. They haven't really, part of it is, I think, particularly for Twitter, it's hard for, just in a few characters to have a robust conversation, right? You tend, zingers work better on Twitter than nuanced moral argument. And so I think that's part of the problem as well. It'll be interesting to see, we've also seen like as a result of, for example, former President Trump being banned, right? The launch of other things like Gab and Truth Social, for people to go that'll be completely uncensored. So it's deeply troubling. It certainly makes a difference. We certainly see it in the media side. Like I said, you can, across our survey, for example, the social media is fractured, other kinds of media are fractured. So it's a reflection of the broader media landscape, with people just tuning in to their own little silos, right? And that has driven us, I think, further and further apart. And just on that one note about in our survey, when you ask people who most trust Fox News, and by the way, there's more people who say that than said they trust broadcast networks today. But among that group, you can see 20 to 30 percentage points difference, particularly on things around American identity and protecting this idea of a white Christian country. So immigration, attitudes around Islam, attitudes around like denials of the even existence of systemic racism, like all of these things, deeply connected. So I'm kind of in a wait and see. The one thing about Twitter, just as a reality check, it's not the place, it's not the largest social network. It tends to be a place that like reporters and other folks like that are on. So it doesn't nearly have the reach of Instagram or TikTok or some of the other places. It tends to be older, folks than some of those other places as well.
The other thing I would point out, I think Robbie's absolutely right. I think that especially that this kind of echo chamber effect that happens, that people tune in to those platforms and those medias on platforms that tend to reinforce their already existing worldview. And so I don't think there's a whole lot of engagement that can happen there, at least in terms of possibilities of conversion. I do want to point out something that is that I've been gratified by, and that is an old-fashioned tool such as the boycott. For example, recently, Kanye West has been making news with his really vile anti-Semitic rhetoric, and yet people demanding that his sponsors take action to punish and curb his behavior and to say, this is unacceptable. The very fact that the same kinds of pressures have been brought to bear on certain news hosts, like Fox News, for example, and others who have gone beyond the pale, and they've then have been corrected, reprimanded by, again, grassroots people demanding that their corporate sponsors not support this kind of behavior. I think that that's something, Joan, you asked earlier, like, what can we do going forward?
Yeah.
I mean, these are advances. I mean, it's not a perfect tool, but again, it can be an effective tool. So no, regardless of what Twitter does, there are ways of holding people who have these views, especially more influential and public figures, to account, especially by bringing pressure to bear upon them in terms of their commercial enterprises. I think that can be a very effective means of participating in our public discourse and saying that there are certain things which should be beyond the pale and we're not going to tolerate.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that we all have to understand that we have responsibilities as citizens, and part of that responsibility is to speak up when there are things going on in our society that are not contributing to the common good, that are not contributing to the expansion of democratic rights. And the more that we do that, whether it's through a boycott or it's through podcasts or newsletters or programs like this, the more people who have the power to make these changes will acquiesce and make the changes that are needed. So, Colin, are there any other questions coming from our Mercyhurst students? We didn't hear that, whatever.
Hi, my name is Mara Isaacson. I'm a junior here at Mercyhurst. I'm a dance major, and I'm also working on a minor in social justice. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I'm still a practicing Catholic today. So one of my main concerns is that people of color do not feel welcome in the Catholic Church. And I believe that the Catholic Church should be a welcoming place to all. I read that Father Massingale said, "Your ministry has been to help the church understand that God has already gifted people of color with dignity and value and worth." So my question is, how do we, as members of the church, make people of color feel dignified and valued and of worth? And will this help people of color feel more welcome in the Catholic Church?
Thank you, Mara. Father Bryan.
Wow, that first, kudos to you. I mean, when I see someone like you, you are not the future of the church. You are the church. So thank you, first of all, for absolutely. I see someone applauding in the background there. Absolutely, absolutely. That we always say young people are the future of the church. No, young people are the church. And so thank you for that question. I think that one of the sad things, I'll start with a sad thing and then a happy thing. One of the sad things, I think, is that I think that white Catholics will find a more welcome hospitality in Black Catholic churches and in Black Catholic spaces than Black Catholics often find in white Catholic spaces. That when white people enter into a Black Catholic church, like I help out at St. Charles Borromeo here in Harlem, white Catholics come, visitors all the time, and there is a welcome and there's an embrace. Whereas I, as a Black Catholic priest, have come to white suburban parishes, and even if I'm wearing my collar, people look at me like, well, what are you doing here? Are you a real priest? And so I think, what can white Catholics do? One, I think, is an attitude change. And that is to realize that one of the joys of being Catholic is that we have sisters and brothers in the faith who don't look like us, that we belong to a worldwide church, and that we belong to a global church, and that most of the church does not pray the way we do. And that's a good thing, because that's what it means to be Catholic, to be universal. And so I think that's an attitudinal change. What can white Catholics do? One is to insist that we are Catholic. That means that we are universal. So that's the first thing. Will that help make Black Catholics and other Catholics of color more welcome? Absolutely. Another thing that can be done is that I've been in white Catholic churches where a music minister will introduce a song with a Spanish refrain, for example, and people will say, well, why are we singing that? We don't have any Spanish people in this parish. And I said, well, no, but you have sisters and brothers who do sing Spanish. And part of being a universal church means that we can learn to pray, at least in some ways, in each other's languages. That's another small thing, but it's an important thing. So yes, I think that all of those are ways. And the other thing I would say is that as a white ally, to really be an ally, and that is when you see racial injustice, when you hear racial injustice, don't let it pass you by. Speak up and challenge it. You don't have to give a long dissertation. All you have to do is say, hey, I don't find that joke funny. Because when I, as a Black person, say that there's a racial issue here, people look at me and say, oh, you're just playing the race card. But when a white person says there is a racial issue here, that's heard differently. And so what can you as a white Catholic, what can all of my fellow white Catholics do, my fellow Catholics who are white descent do? And that is when you hear and see racist things happen, don't let it pass you by. Call it out. Don't create safe spaces where racism can incubate. I mean, if more white Catholics called out racism in their family and friends when they saw it, we would very certainly have a very different country and a very different church. And all it does is it takes people to have the courage to call it out. So thanks so much for your, Maura, for your passion, for your question. I mean, people like you give me hope for our church and for our country.
And it's why, for instance, Robbie's work is so important in the communities that he gets to speak with. And
absolutely. What Robbie's doing is, fantastic. And, again, because we can't just put on people of color to fight white supremacy. If white supremacy is going to end, it will be because there's a critical mass of white Christians who say no.
Absolutely.
The only other thing I'll add, just from experience of speaking in a lot of predominantly white spaces, that like in theory want to be welcoming, it is, I think the strategy is often we are welcoming, just insist on that fact. But the idea would be, well, we'll wait till we get a critical mass of people of color, and then we'll think about what we need to change to make them comfortable, right? But that's like a recipe for disaster, rather than proactively thinking like, okay, what does it mean that we have this big white Jesus right behind the pulpit, right? In the church? What does it mean that all of our children's material, right, has white people and no people of color in the picture books, right, or the children's Bibles? What kind of are we still singing hymns like there was a hymn I sung growing up? Wash me and I will be whiter than snow.
White as snow, yes.
Right. And are we still singing that without any sense of like how that might strike someone not white? So I think there's a lot of things that people can do to make the space welcoming beforehand, like start now. The only other thing I would say is that, the clock is ticking, right? Young people are not patient, right? And are looking at the church, and we see it in the data. Nearly 4 in 10 Americans under the age of 30 have just said, like, see ya to religion, right? Who claim no religious faith at all. We've never seen a generation that unaffiliated before. And when we ask them, it is largely about the politicization and partisanship that they find in churches, a kind of silence on the issues they care about: race, LGBTQ rights, climate change. These are also part of, I think, making a space that is more cosmopolitan, more universal, so that it's not just that we're going to theoretically welcome people in, but there's concrete things to be done.
Yeah.
Right. And you said something so important, Robbie. I just want to piggyback on it. We're not doing it in order to welcome a critical mass of other people. We're doing it because this is what the church is supposed to be about.
Right.
So we're not doing it so that, so you're not doing it for my sake, for people, or for Black people. You're doing it because this is what it means to be church.
Yeah.
And so it's the integrity and credibility of the church which is on the line. And so it's not just a matter of saying, oh, let's wait till we have, enough of them to welcome them. No, we're becoming a racially just community, because that's what it means to be the Church of Jesus Christ.
All right, I got to add one more thing to this, because I think this is so right. And it's a thing that occurred, I think, frankly, late to me. And James Baldwin, the great African-American writer, like really helped me get here. He had this great line where he describes the civil rights movement as what happened when an oppressed and despised people began to wake up to what had happened to them. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to kind of turn that, though, and to say, like, what would happen if white Christian churches also woke up to what had happened to us? Right. And I think it's exactly that we think that we have so little at stake, I think, in so many of these, like it's an act of altruism for us to kind of turn our churches into something different. But to what you were saying, Father Bryan, I mean, we can't really even work out our own salvation in the kinds of churches we've created, right? That we can't properly do it because it's not actually the church that's really gathered there. It's like some weird, subset that is kind of gathered around whiteness.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is a good place for us to transition as our time is getting very short. And the bottom line, it seems to me, is that is who we are called to be as Christians, whether we are Catholic Christians or Protestant Christians, that we are to be the leaven in our society. And that means that wherever we see injustice and inequity, that we have to call it out. And that we have to follow it up with behavior that changes conditions, that promotes justice, and that makes a way in terms of our democracy for a diverse, multi-faith, pluralistic society. Erie, I know that you have one more question in the queue, but I'm afraid we're going to have to say thank you so much for your participation. It was just wonderful to hear the voices of young people who are hopefully, maybe, who are going to be that leaven in our society that once and for all maybe puts us on the right path. Thank you, Colin, for bringing our Mercyhurst students to us. And we hope that the rest of your day is really great. And so, my friends, I think we've come to the end of a very significant, enlightening, and timely conversation once again. Certainly at Network, our profound thanks to both of you, Father Bryan Massingale, Dr. Robert P. Jones, for once again helping us to unpack and to understand the political, religious, and cultural change that our country is undergoing, for showing us how we should interpret what is happening, and for leaving us with a modicum of hope for a future that is brighter than our present reality. I think one of the things that I am taking away from this conversation is the focus on the virtue of courage and our exercising our ability to stand up and speak truth. So we can make a difference in the outcome for our country, especially the outcome of the midterm elections that are coming up. We can put people in office who will actually work for the common good, the advancement of a vision of democracy that is pluralistic, equitable, and welcoming of all. We can do these things. The future is in our hands. And as Robbie reminded us earlier, it is our choice to make, and history is calling us, each of us and all of us, to make the right choice and right decision today. I want to say to everybody out there, remember that your vote is your voice, and your voice is your right in democracy. Use it wisely in 2 weeks and beyond. So I'll just ask Father Bryan and Robbie, if you have one last word you'd like to leave with us. It has to be short, but is there anything you'd like us to walk away with this afternoon?
You want to go first, Robbie, or you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I just find myself coming back. I'm so grateful again for Sister Addie Lorraine's remarks at the beginning. And I think this is where, like, my heart is this morning. It's just like this time let's let it be different this time.
Thank you, Robbie. Bryan.
I want to go back to what Sister Addie not only said, but the deep passion with which she prayed. And I think that one of the things I hear more and more from people who are doing racial justice work is the conviction that we cannot vote our way out of this. We cannot legislate our way out of this. That what we're doing is a deeply spiritual work, and that we really need to be rooted in and sustained by something that is much bigger than we are. And so in addition to voting, in addition to being informed, we need to become people of passionate prayer and to pray to be these agents of justice and courage that will enable us to be signs of hope for a world and a country that really desperately need it.
The only thing to say to that is amen, right? So thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Be sure to share what you have learned with others. Everyone who registered will be sent a link for today's recording, and you can always go to our website at www.networklobby.org for more information on ways to get involved. Please share all of this information widely. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again to Father Bryan and to Dr. Robert P.